Hi, welcome to this video where I'm going to introduce classes and object-oriented programming. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to create your member variables and the constructors for a class. So let's get started. Our sample class for this video is going to be a class to keep track of a point. And a point is simply a XY coordinate on a graph. So go back to your geometry days for that. So you'll notice that I typed in class point and an open open curly brace, and then it automatically added or code blocks added a closing curly brace along with the semicolon. So the first thing you need to notice about a class definition is that a semicolon is always added at the end of the closing curly brace. A class definition will consist of several parts, but the two primary parts are a private section, which is where we're going to store the data for our class, and then a public section where we're going to write the interface or the functions, what are called member functions, that work with them. And we'll get back to member functions in a separate video, but for this video I'm just going to cover one type of member function called a constructor. But let's go back. So the first thing I want to do is define my member variables, or the data that I'm going to keep track of in the class. And for that, that's going to be my XY coordinates, which I'm going to define as integers. So my two private member variables will be X and Y. And for now, that's the only thing I'm going to put in the private section. So the next thing we want to do is create a constructor. And what a constructor does is a constructor allows us to create a new object and put some data into that object at the time of creating. It's kind of like declaring a variable and assigning it a value in the same statement. So a constructor is just a function that has the same name as the class itself. And so we write parameters just like we would write for a regular function. In this case, it's going to be the X and Y coordinates that we're going to assign to the private variables. And then all we have to do in the body of our constructor is do that assignment. So X gets the value of new X and Y gets the value of new Y. And now that constructor will have set our X and Y coordinates. To use that in our main program, we can write point P1 just like we're declaring a regular variable, but instead of doing an equal sign, we're going to do a function call to call the constructor with the values for X and Y, like that. So this particular point P1 will have a X coordinate of 1 and a Y coordinate of 2. Now, if we run this program, nothing's going to happen because we don't have any output yet. So we'll compile and run. You'll see that there is no output. No output. So let's get some output. So to do that, we're going to add one other member function to our program. And we'll just call this display. And what it's going to do is it's going to write out to the screen the values for my X coordinate and my Y coordinate. And I'm just kind of making a little fancy display here, like that. So once you've created a member function like display, to call it, you use the dot operator with your object. And so to display the point, I'm just going to type p1.display. So now when we run this program, we see that our X coordinate is 1 and our Y coordinate is 2 for our point P1, which we assigned the values 1 for X, 2 for Y. So that very briefly and very succinctly is how we begin creating a class definition. So let's review real quick. Classes start out with class definitions start out with the keyword class, followed by the name of the class. And I forgot to mention, we always capitalize the first letter of a class definition so that we can distinguish that from a regular variable. or even a data type. And remember that when you type the open and closing curly braces, that the compiler is going to add a semicolon to the end to indicate that this is a class definition. Next, we have two sections for our program, private and public. Private is where we're going to put our member variables, and public is where we're going to write the member functions that make up the interface or the way we interact with our object. Inside public, we created a constructor. A constructor is a function that has the same name as the class, and we use constructors to initialize a new class object with data. So this constructor, let's put a little comment here. This constructor has two parameters for the x and y coordinates, and the body of the constructor simply sets those. So I also created another member function display so that we could see what was in our object. And so then I have a main program where I create or instantiate a new object. Let me write that out as a comment. Instantiate. That's the term we use for creating a new class object. In other words, P1 is an instance of, let me write that out. P1 is an instance of point. And so that process is called instantiation or instantiate. And then we want to display what's in P1, so we call the member function display by naming the object and then the dot operator and then the member function. Let me run it one more time. There's x1, y2. And that wraps up this first video on creating and using classes.